Hello there everyone. So we're going to round off what we said in the previous video by looking at the ways that this concept that I call the world image is incorporated by ideological systems. Firstly, I'm going to refresh our memories a bit about what the world image actually is, and then say something about ideologies in general and talk about how these two systems interact. So here goes. Every human being is an incubator of information that is partly inherited at birth and partly acquired from life experience. This information is converted by the brain into the mind's media, images, dreams, fantasies, narratives, and moods, for example. Not only can this information be converted into mental media, it can also be converted into other types of media as well, such as visual art, literature, and information systems such as ideologies. We need to start thinking about media subjects like pictures and books, not in the mundane way that we commonly do, but as crystallizations of embodied information that were once part of a living organism. So with that being said, what is a world image? A world image is an impression of the environment shaped by the mind out of its own experiences and identifications. Just like a work of art is a distillation of a particular aspect of life, such as a depiction of a landscape or a battlefield, a world image is a distilled impression of our embodied information projected onto the overall environment. This projection that has come to characterize a significant aspect of our personal life then comes to characterize the world in general. When we hear people say things like, "The world is full of possibility," or "The world is a den of corruption," we are listening to people convey their world images in that moment, and it further goes on to tell us something about how their brains and nervous systems have come to relate to existence. Therefore, we relate to the world not merely as raw sense data, but as the embodied impressions of our own psychological nature. The world image, like all generalizations, is an aspect of a system communicated as a whole. And very much like a work of art, the world image is formed out of our own limitations and identifications. So let's talk about these limitations because it will be really important later on for when we come to understand ideologies. The most important thing to take note of is that the mind's representation of the world is a byproduct of the limits placed upon our intelligence. All human intelligence is bottlenecked, meaning that in order for us to reconcile a problem using the information that we've accumulated throughout our life, the brain has to selectively sample from its information sets and filter out the unnecessary. This means that every time that we think about anything, from the mundane to the complex, we are harnessing but a thimbleful of our mind's ocean. And when we come to think about it, this filtering is absolutely necessary, because if we had access to our maximum capacity all at once, all we would experience is chaos, and we would never be able to selectively sample and discriminate to consider anything effectively. Like all of the brain's operations, this attribute, however necessary and useful, is a double-edged sword. It enables us to reconcile with complexity, but by doing so it also cleaves off a lot of information that might also be potentially useful or offer a creative insight. Even at the level of genius, our perceptions have to be constrained in order to process things in isolation properly. But by doing so, we typically think about things in shades rather than as the complex systems that they truly are. Therefore, we only ever receive and perceive pieces of the jigsaw puzzle of information, and often out of our own hubris and a rush towards a quick solution, we often interpret the pieces that we hold for the real picture. This is the most important thing that we can realize about human claims on what the world is, and by extension, how ideology is an outgrowth of this cognitive filtering. So with all that being said, we can now move on to the main segment of this video, which is the interaction between world images and ideological systems. One way to talk about ideologies in a practical sense is to say that ideologies are condensations of complex information, organised into widely understandable systems of imagery and narrative that attempt to influence human behaviour towards predetermined outcomes. As we said at the beginning of this video, ideologies, like works of art, are extensions of this primary ability in the psyche to convert received information into alternative media. And an ideology is just that. It is an extended ecosystem of the psyche in miniature, replete with its own images, narratives, fantasies of ideal outcomes, idols, figureheads, devil figures, and most of all, an overall representation of the environment that awards closure and meaning surrounding particular subjects of interest. The last characteristic about closure and meaning is major. Ideologies are attractive because they award the mind with a ready-made representation of life that distills the overwhelming complexity of our information into a discernible face that we can relate to and feel like that we can work with towards our ends. When a radical feminist looks out onto the world and sees an oppressive patriarchy, they are not so much seeing the world as it is, rather a representation of it. That is not to say that the ideological representation does not contain certain elements of truth to it, but it will always be a distillation of complex subjects, and never the subjects incarnate. We have to always retain the reality that this doesn't nullify the effects of such a world image, because it awards the mind of the radical feminist with closure and infers powerful meaning to her pre-existing embodied identifications that have derived from her life experience. This is so important to understand because it reveals that a large part of the reason why people become so enthralled to ideological systems isn't because they're fools. It's because we all carry around with us the embodied memory of our lives. We could say that we are the embodiment of our lives. This embodied memory is incredibly meaningful to the psyche. It influences so many things that have come to characterize and shape our life. And throughout our life, we will all come into contact with information and people that speak to these embodied memories in some way, either positively or negatively. An ideology, if it's to be effective at all in reaching out to people, has to make contact with something meaningful inside the people that it wants to influence. It has nothing whatsoever to do with what ideology possesses the most truth to it. It all falls down to what ideology contains the most meaning to the psyches of those alive today. We should now be able to see that the world images of the psyche, just like the ideological narratives that import meaning into the lives of people that they reach, are part of the same family of phenomena. One cannot exist without the other. In fact, I offer that ideological systems would not even exist without the psyche's capacity to create world images within its own ecosystem. And even though the world images of both are too simplistic to contain the world's real complexity, that does not disqualify their real purpose, which is to award closure and meaning. The world images of ideology offer the mind with a meaningful impression that makes sense on some level, and that's all that's really needed to tolerate its shortcomings, because, contrary to what people will say in public, most people don't actually want to understand the world as it is. They don't want a complicated, scientific readout of things that requires a master's degree level of understanding. What they want instead is a face that is discernible at the personal level, and that awards people with the sense, perhaps even the hubris, that they have tamed the chaos within and without. Now we're really coming full circle to the creation of world images in the psyche. Ideologies map onto the existing ability of the mind to convert internalized information into generalized impressions of the environment. We could say that successful ideologies provide not only an image of the world, but also a map to navigate it. At the practical level, this is incredibly beneficial in terms of facilitating group cohesion, because if enough people are on the same map, generally speaking, it reinforces cooperation and makes working towards wider goals more amenable. It draws people together of different backgrounds, intelligence and ability under a common ecosystem for effective action, and lays the template for all kinds of new projects to begin. And so by having more people on your side, it also enhances the optimism that complex problems can be solved. Therefore, representation often trumps accuracy. It is not in our brain's prerogative to represent the world as it actually is in increasingly reliable and realistic ways. Rather, our representations of the world form pragmatic models with which the mind can use as a launchpad towards other strategies. And again, I think that ideologies speak directly to this. So I now want to close by briefly saying something about how these world images influence our ways of perceiving things, because this is an area where ideology comes under a lot of flack. Some of this criticism is certainly justified, but my problem with a lot of the anti-ideology ideologues is that their analysis is too totalistic, and therefore it always misses the deeper nuances as to why humans might need these systems in the first place. Contrary to the way that we in the West might think about it, the world needs to be represented before it can be understood. Even a scientist who believes that he is alienating himself from the restricting follies of such lenses by using the scientific method still relates to his workspace and its subjects in a representational way. Even a sterilized laboratory is not immune from the effects of representation. To the psyche, it is still a microcosm of a world, a territorial landscape of imagery and meaning, replete with its own hierarchies, customs, rites, and specialized symbols. We use the world image in our language all the time, and often we don't even realize that we're doing so. So when we hear about certain scientists talking about human beings as being insignificant specks in a vast cosmic ocean, they're exploiting a metaphorical language and converting that into a world image, whether they realize that they're doing so or not. And like we said before with the feminist example, this way of talking about the world in relation to a world image is a byproduct of the restrictions placed upon our cognition, and this helps us to draw down complexity into a representational skin, which the mind can then relate to, and mesh language and strategy around it appropriately. Some biological determinists would suggest that everything that we do is simply a reaction to base stimuli. However, the mind doesn't simply relate to life as raw data like a machine. The world and ourselves in it has to be represented so that we can engage with it. So even though they might think that they're being sophisticated, this characterization by the biological determinist is unwittingly speaking from the point of a world image, that of a scientifically measurable, reductionistic universe full of lumbering robots, as Richard Dawkins famously said. I want to make clear that the message of this video is not anti-ideology. Ideology, like the brain's constraints upon our intelligence, plays an important managerial role in helping us to organize towards complicated goals such as culture formation and self-preservation. It, like cultural systems, is an extension of what we are as living things, and those that advocate for a negation of ideology are in a sense negating an important component of what engineers our life systems together. However, that doesn't mean to say that critiques of ideological systems and how they influence our psychology are not necessary, because, for one, ideologies are condensations of complex information, and therefore always leave out more than they take in. As a consequence of this, the shortcomings of the ideology can easily become the shortcomings of those that interact with them by limiting their ability to comprehend insights beyond its accepted tenets. Also, all ideologies, no matter what their outward advertisement, are essentially conservative in nature, and therefore don't always update to reflect the organic developments that occur in every society over time. For people beholden to ideological systems, this can sometimes create a schism between the idealized world image in their minds and the contradictory shape of society as it appears. Depending upon the nature of this relationship and other psychological factors coming into the minds of these individuals, this can lead to increased dissatisfaction, alienation, resentment, and even sociopathy, a brewing rage directed towards a world that doesn't reflect the identified ecosystem of idealized forms within the mind. Saying this, I think that there's a lot more that we could say about the consequences of ideology and how it pertains to human psychology, but I wanted this video really to just be a primer on the subject, so perhaps if people are interested, we could return to it in some time. Though for now, I think I'm going to leave it there and say thanks very much for watching again, and as usual, I'll see you again.